Hi friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. In this session, we are going to talk about an international standard, ISO 13485 2016, Medical Devices, Quality Management Systems. In this session, we shall cover all the requirements of ISO 13485 2016, Medical Devices, Quality Management Systems in detail. Let's discuss about the outcome of this session. After completing this session, you will be enabled to understand all the requirements of ISO 13485 2016 medical devices, quality management systems necessary to support the operations of the standard. Before discussing the standard, let me give you a brief idea about International Organization for Standardization, or ISO in short. ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, is a worldwide federation of national standards bodies, ISO member bodies. The work of preparing international standards is normally carried out through ISO technical committees. Each member body interested in a subject for whom a technical committee has been established has the right to be represented on that committee. International organizations, governmental and non-governmental, in liaison with ISO also take part in the work. ISO collaborates closely with the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC, on all matters of electrotechnical standardization. Let's have a general introduction of the standard. This international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system that can be used by an organization involved in one or more stages of the life cycle of a medical device, including design and development, production, storage and distribution, installation, servicing, and final decommissioning and disposal of medical devices, and designing and development, or provision of associated activities, example, technical support. The requirements in this international standard can also be used by suppliers or other external parties providing products, example, raw materials, components, sub-assemblies, medical devices, sterilization services, calibration services, distribution services, maintenance services to such organizations. The supplier or external party can voluntarily choose to conform to the requirements of this standard or can be required by contract to conform. Several jurisdictions have regulatory requirements for the application of quality management systems by organizations with a variety of roles in the supply chain for medical devices. Consequently, this international standard expects that the organization identifies its role or roles under applicable regulatory requirements, identifies the regulatory requirements that apply to its activities under these roles, incorporates these applicable regulatory requirements within its quality management system. The definitions in applicable regulatory requirements differ from nation to nation and region to region. The organization needs to understand how the definitions in this international standard will be interpreted in light of regulatory definitions in the jurisdictions in which the medical devices are made available. This international standard can also be used by internal and external parties, including certification bodies, to assess the organization's ability to meet customer and regulatory requirements applicable to the quality management system and the organization's own requirements. It is emphasized that the quality management system requirements specified in this international standard are complementary to the technical requirements for product that are necessary to meet customer and applicable regulatory requirements for safety and performance. The adoption of a quality management system is a strategic decision of an organization. The design and implementation of an organization's quality management system is influenced by the organizational environment, changes in that environment, and the influence that the organizational environment has on the conformity of the medical devices, organizations' varying needs, organizations' particular objectives, product the organization provides, processes the organization employs, organization's size and organizational structure, regulatory requirements applicable to the organization's activities. It is not the intent of this international standard to imply the need for uniformity in the structure of different quality management systems, uniformity of documentation, or alignment of documentation to the clause structure of this international standard. There is a wide variety of medical devices, and some of the particular requirements of this international standard only apply to named groups of medical devices. These groups are defined in Clause 3 of the standard. Let me discuss now the process approach. This international standard is based on a process approach to quality management. Any activity that receives input and converts it to output can be considered as a process. Often, the output from one process directly forms the input to the next process. For an organization to function effectively, it needs to identify and manage numerous linked processes. The application of a system of processes within an organization, together with the identification and interactions of these processes and their management to produce the desired outcome, can be referred to as the process approach. When used within a quality management system, such an approach emphasizes the importance of understanding and meeting requirements, considering processes in terms of added value, obtaining results of processes performance and effectiveness, improving processes based on objective measurement. Let's discuss about the relationship of this ISO 13485 with ISO 9001 quality management system. While this is a stand-alone standard, it is based on ISO 9001-2008, which has been superseded by ISO 9001-2015. This international standard is intended to facilitate global alignment of appropriate regulatory requirements for quality management systems applicable to organizations involved in one or more stages of the life cycle of a medical device. This international standard includes some particular requirements for organizations involved in the life cycle of medical devices and excludes some of the requirements of ISO 9001 that are not appropriate as regulatory requirements. Because of these exclusions, organizations whose quality management systems conform to this international standard cannot claim conformity to ISO 9001 unless their quality management system meets all the requirements of ISO 9001. Coming to the compatibility aspects of ISO 13485-2016 with other management systems. This international standard does not include requirements specific to other management systems, such as those particular to environmental management, occupational health and safety management, or financial management. However, this international standard enables an organization to align or integrate its own quality management system with related management system requirements. It is possible for an organization to adapt its existing management system in order to establish a quality management system that complies with the requirements of this international standard. Friends, this was basic information about this standard. Now, let me start with the requirements of ISO 13485-2016, Medical Devices Quality Management Systems. In this session, we shall cover the 8 clauses of the standard in this session. We shall cover the 8 clauses of the standard. These clauses are scope, normative references, terms and definitions, quality management system, management responsibility, resource management, product realization, measurement, analysis, and improvement. We shall also talk in this session about the comparison of content between ISO 13485 2003 and ISO 13485 2016 and correspondence between ISO 13485 2016 and ISO 9001 2015. Further, you can see here the bibliography at the end of the session for more details. So friends, let's start with the scope. This international standard, ISO 13485 2016, specifies requirements for a quality management system where an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to provide medical devices and related services that consistently meet customer and applicable regulatory requirements. Such organizations can be involved in one or more stages of the life cycle, including design and development, production, storage and distribution, installation or servicing of a medical device, and design and development or provision of associated activities, example, technical support. This international standard can also be used by suppliers or external parties that provide products, including quality management system, related services to such organizations. Requirements of this international standard are applicable to organizations regardless of their size and of their type, except where explicitly stated. Wherever requirements are specified as applying to medical devices, the requirements apply equally to associated services as supplied by the organization. The processes required by this international standard that are applicable to the organization but are not performed by the organization are the responsibilities of the organization and are accounted for in the organization's quality management system by monitoring, maintaining, and controlling the processes. If applicable regulatory requirements permit exclusions of design and development controls, this can be used as a justification for their exclusion from the quality management system. These regulatory requirements can provide alternative approaches that are to be addressed in the quality management system. It is the responsibility of the organization to ensure that claims of conformity to this international standard reflect any exclusion of design and development controls. If any requirement in clauses 6, 7, or 8 of this international standard is not applicable due to the activities undertaken by the organization or the nature of the medical device for which the quality management system is applied, the organization does not need to include such a requirement in its quality management system. For any clause that is determined to be not applicable, the organization records the justification as described in Subclause 4.2.2. Coming to the clause 2, normative references. According to ISO 13485 2016, the standard in whole or in part are normatively referenced in this document and are indispensable for its application. Edition cited only applies for dated references. For undated references, the latest edition of the referenced document, including any amendments, applies. Further, this standard refer ISO 9000 2015 Quality Management Systems, Fundamentals and Vocabulary for more information about it. Let's start with the clause 3, Terms and Definitions. The standard states that for the purposes of this document, the terms and definitions given in ISO 9000 2015 apply. Apart from that, some other terms which I am going to explain now, also apply under this standard ISO 13485 2016. Advisory Notice. Advisory notice is a notice issued by the organization subsequent to delivery of the medical device to provide supplementary information or to advise on action to be taken in the use of a medical device, modification of a medical device, return of the medical device to the organization that supplied it, or destruction of a medical device. Authorized representative. Authorized representative is a natural or legal person established within a country or jurisdiction who has received a written mandate from the manufacturer to act on his behalf for specified tasks with regards to the latter's obligations under that country or jurisdiction's legislation. Clinical evaluation. Clinical evaluation is an assessment and analysis of clinical data pertaining to a medical device to verify the clinical safety and performance of the device when used as intended by the manufacturer. Complaint. Complaint is written, electronic, or oral communication that alleges deficiencies related to the identity, quality, durability, reliability, usability, safety, or performance of a medical device that has been released from the organization's control or related to a service that affects the performance of such medical devices. Distributor. A distributor is natural or a legal person in the supply chain who, on his own behalf, furthers the availability of a medical device to the end user. Implantable medical device is a medical device which can only be removed by medical or surgical intervention and which is intended to be totally or partially introduced into the human body or a natural orifice, or replace an epithelial surface or the surface of the eye and remain after the procedure for at least 30 days. Importer. Importer is a natural or a legal person in the supply chain who is the first in a supply chain to make a medical device manufactured in another country or jurisdiction, available in the country or jurisdiction where it is to be marketed. Labeling. Labeling is a label, instructions for use, and any other information that is related to identification, technical description, intended purpose, and proper use of the medical device, but excluding shipping documents. Life cycle. All phases in the life of a medical device, from the initial conception to the final decommissioning and disposal. Manufacturer. Manufacturer is a natural or a legal person with responsibilities for design and or manufacture of a medical device with the intention of making the medical device available for use under his name, whether or not such a medical device is designed and or manufactured by that person himself or on his behalf by another person. Medical device. Medical device is an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, appliance, implant, reagent for in vitro use, software, material, or other similar or related article intended by the manufacturer to be used, alone or in combination, for human beings, for one or more of the specific medical purpose or purposes of diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of disease. Diagnosis, monitoring, treatment, alleviation of or compensation for an injury. Investigation, replacement, modification, or support of the anatomy or of a physiological process. Supporting or sustaining life. Control of conception. Disinfection of medical devices. Providing information by means of in vitro examination of specimens derived from the human body and does not achieve its primary intended action by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means in or on the human body, but which may be assisted in its intended function by such means. Medical device family. Medical device family is a group of medical devices manufactured by or for the same organization by having the same basic design and performance characteristics related to safety, intended use, and function. Performance evaluation. Performance evaluation is assessment and analysis of data to establish or verify the ability of an in vitro diagnostic medical device to achieve its intended use. Post-market surveillance. Post-market surveillance is a systematic process to collect and analyze experience gained from medical devices that have been placed on the market. Product. Product is a result of a process. This definition of product differs from the definition given in ISO 9000-2015. Purchased product. Purchased product is a product provided by a party outside the organization's quality management system. Risk. Risk is a combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. Risk management. Risk management is a systematic application of management policies, procedures, and practices to the tasks of analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risk. Sterile barrier system. Sterile barrier system is a minimum package that prevents ingress of microorganisms and allows aseptic presentation of the product at the point of use. Sterile medical device. Sterile medical device is medical device intended to meet the requirements for sterility. Friends, we have covered the clause 3, terms and definitions of ISO 13485-2016. Now, let's talk about the clause 4, quality management system. This section has two clauses, which are clause 4.1, general requirements, clause 4.2, documentation requirements. Let me start with the clause 4.1, general requirements. The subclause 4.1.1 states that the organization is required to document a quality management system and maintain its effectiveness in accordance with the requirements of this international standard and applicable regulatory requirements. According to this subclause 4.1.1, the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain any requirement, procedure, activity, or arrangement required to be documented by this international standard or applicable regulatory requirements. Lastly, this subclause specifies that the organization is required to document the roles undertaken by the organization under the applicable regulatory requirements. As a guidance, standard here in this subclause states that the roles undertaken by the organization can include manufacturer, authorized representative, importer, or distributor. Let's come to the subclause 4.1.2. According to this subclause, the organization is required to determine the processes needed for the quality management system and the application of these processes throughout the organization, taking into account the roles undertaken by the organization. Subclause 4.1.2 says that the organization is required to apply a risk-based approach to the control of the appropriate processes needed for the quality management system. As per this clause, the organization is required to determine the sequence and interaction of these processes. Coming to subclause 4.1.3. According to this subclause 4.1.3 of ISO 13485-2016, for each quality management system process, the organization is required to determine criteria and methods needed to ensure that both the operation and control of these processes are effective. The Subclause 4.1.3 states that organization is required to ensure the availability of resources and information necessary to support the operation and monitoring of these processes. To meet the requirements of this standard, Subclause states that an organization is required to implement actions necessary to achieve planned results and maintain the effectiveness of these processes. Subclause 4.1.3 specifies that organization is required to monitor, measure as appropriate and analyze these processes, and also to establish and maintain records needed to demonstrate conformance to this international standard and compliance with applicable regulatory requirements. Let's talk about the subclause 4.1.4 of ISO 13485-2016. The subclause 4.1.4 states that the organization is required to manage these quality management system processes in accordance with the requirements of this international standard and applicable regulatory requirements. Changes to be made to these processes are required to be evaluated for their impact on the quality management system. This clause says that changes to be made to these processes are required to be evaluated for their impact on the medical devices produced under this quality management system. This subclause 4.1.4 specifies that changes to be made to these processes are required to be controlled in accordance with the requirements of this international standard and applicable regulatory requirements. Let's discuss the subclause 4.1.5 now. This subclause 4.1.5 states that when the organization chooses to outsource any process that affects product conformity to requirements, it is required to monitor and ensure control over such processes. The organization is required to retain responsibility of conformity to this international standard and to customer and applicable regulatory requirements for outsourced processes. The controls shall be proportionate to the risk involved and the ability of the external party to meet the requirements in accordance with subclause 7.4 of the standard. The controls are required to include written quality agreements. Coming to subclause 4.1.6. The subclause 4.1.6 of the standard specifies that the organization is required to document procedures for the validation of the application of computer software used in the quality management system. Such software applications are required to be validated prior to initial use and, as appropriate, after changes to such software of its application. As per this clause 4.1.6, the specific approach and activities associated with software validation and revalidation are required to be proportionate to the risk associated with the use of the software. Records of such activities shall be maintained. Coming to clause 4.2, documentation requirements. The subclause 4.2.1 general specifies that the quality management system documentation is required to include documented statements of a quality policy and quality objectives, a quality manual and documented procedures and records required by this international standard. As per this subclause, the quality management system documentation is also required to include documents, including records determined by the organization to be necessary to ensure the effective planning, operation, and control of its processes. Subclause 4.2.1 also says that the quality management system documentation is required to contain other documentation specified by applicable regulatory requirements. Let's talk about clause 4.2.2, Quality Manual. This subclause 4.2.2 states that the organization is required to document a quality manual that includes the scope of the quality management system, including details of and justification for any exclusion or non-application. As per this subclause, the organization is required to document a quality manual that includes the documented procedures for the quality management system or reference to them. Clause also states that the quality manual must include a description of the interaction between the processes of the quality management system. As per this subclause 4.2.2, the quality manual is required to outline the structure of the documentation used in the quality management system. Let's talk about subclause 4.2.3, medical device file. This clause specifies that for each medical device type or medical device family, the organization is required to establish and maintain one or more files either containing or referencing documents generated to demonstrate conformity to the requirement of this international standard and compliance with applicable regulatory requirements. As per this clause, the content of the file is required to include, but is not limited to, general description of the medical device, intended use or purpose, and labeling, including any instructions for use. According to this clause, the content of the file is required to include the following: specifications for product, specifications of procedures for manufacturing, packaging, storage, handling, and distribution, procedures for measuring and monitoring, as appropriate requirements for installation, as appropriate procedures for servicing. Coming to 4.2.4, control of documents. The subclause 4.2.4 of ISO 13485 2016 states that the documents required by the quality management system are required to be controlled. Records are a special type of document and required to be controlled according to the requirements given in subclause 4.2.5. According to this subclause 4.2.4, a documented procedure is required to define the controls needed to review and approve documents for adequacy prior to issue, review, update as necessary, and reapprove documents, ensure that the current revision status of and changes to documents are identified, ensure that relevant versions of applicable documents are available at points of use, ensure that documents of external origin determined by the organization to be necessary for the planning and operation of the quality management system are identified and their distribution controlled, prevent deterioration or loss of documents, and prevent the unintended use of obsolete documents and apply suitable identification to them. The organization is required to ensure that changes to documents are reviewed and approved either by the original approving function or another designated function that has access to pertinent background information upon which to base its decisions. Clause 4.2.4 says that the organization is required to define the period for which at least one copy of obsolete documents shall be retained. This period must ensure that documents to which medical devices have been manufactured and tested are available for at least the lifetime of the medical device as defined by the organization, but not less than the retention period of any resulting record, or as specified by applicable regulatory requirements. Let's talk about 4.2.5, control of records. As per this subclause 4.2.5, records are required to be maintained to provide evidence of conformity to requirements and of the effective operation of the quality management system. Subclause 4.2.5 states that the organization is required to document procedures to define the controls needed for the identification, storage, security and integrity, retrieval, retention time, and disposition of records. According to this subclause 4.2.5, the organization is required to define and implement methods for protecting confidential health information contained in the records in accordance with the applicable regulatory requirements. Subclause 4.2.5 specifies that the records are required to remain legible, readily identifiable, and retrievable. Changes to a record are required to remain identifiable. The subclause 4.2.5 states that the organization is required to retain the records for at least the lifetime of the medical device as defined by the organization or as specified by applicable regulatory requirements, but not less than 2 years from the medical device release by the organization. Let's start with Clause 5, Management Responsibility of ISO 13485-2016. In general, this Clause 5 of the ISO 13485-2016, it specifies that management must demonstrate their commitment by showing they can be held accountable for the operations within their organization. They have to ensure that their focus does not deter from the needs of the end user and that all laws are followed in the manufacturing process. The management has an absolute responsibility to support the quality policy, confirm its alignment with the laws of the country of work, and communicate the mission to employees. They have a responsibility to plan, delegate authority, and communicate effectively. They are also responsible for a periodic review of operations and improvement within the organization, known as the management review. This Clause 5 has been divided into 6 subclauses, which are 5.1 Management Commitment, 5.2 Customer Focus, 5.3 Quality Policy, 5.4 Planning, 5.5 Responsibility, Authority and Communication, 5.6 Management Review. Let's start with the subclause 5.1, Management Commitment. This subclause 5.1 states that top management is required to provide evidence of its commitment to the development and implementation of the quality management system and maintenance of its effectiveness by communicating to the organization the importance of meeting customer as well as applicable regulatory requirements, establishing the quality policy, ensuring that quality objectives are established, conducting management reviews, and ensuring the availability of resources. Coming to subclause 5.2, Customer Focus. Subclause 5.2 Customer Focus of ISO 13485 says that the top management is required to ensure that customer requirements and applicable regulatory requirements are determined and met. Let's talk about subclause 5.3, Quality Policy. This subclause 5.3 states that the top management is required to ensure that the quality policy is applicable to the purpose of the organization and includes a commitment to comply with requirements and to maintain the effectiveness of the quality management system. As per this clause 5.3, the top management is required to ensure that quality policy provides a framework for establishing and reviewing quality objectives and is communicated and understood within the organization. Subclause 5.3 specifies that quality policy is reviewed for continuing suitability. Coming to subclause 5.4, Planning of ISO 13485-2016. The subclause 5.4.1, Quality Objectives, specifies that the top management is required to ensure that the quality objectives, including those needed to meet applicable regulatory requirements and requirements for products, are established at relevant functions and levels within the organization. As per this subclause, the quality objectives are required to be measurable and consistent with the quality policy. Let me talk about subclause 5.4.2, Quality Management System Planning. According to this subclause 5.4.2, top management is required to ensure that the planning of the quality management system is carried out in order to meet the requirements given in Subclause 4.1 of the standard, as well as the quality objectives. The subclause states that top management is required to ensure that the integrity of the quality management system is maintained when changes to the quality management system are planned and implemented. Let's discuss now the Clause 5.5, Responsibility, Authority and Communication of ISO 13485 2016. Let's start with Subclause 5.5.1, Responsibility and Authority. Subclause 5.5.1 states that the top management is required to ensure that the responsibilities and authorities are defined, documented, and communicated within the organization. The clause further says that the top management is required to document the interrelation of all personnel who manage, perform, and verify work affecting quality and must ensure the independence and authority necessary to perform these tasks. Coming to Subclause 5.5.2, Management Representative. The Subclause 5.5.2 of ISO 13485 states that top management is required to appoint a member of management who, irrespective of other responsibilities, has responsibility and authority that includes ensuring that processes needed for the quality management system are documented. As per clause, the responsibility and authority of management representative is required to include reporting to the top management on the effectiveness of the quality management system and any need for improvement. This responsibility and authority of management representative is also required to include ensuring the promotion of awareness of applicable regulatory requirements and quality management system requirements throughout the organization. Let's talk about Subclause 5.5.3, Internal Communication. The Subclause 5.5.3 of ISO 13485 2016 states that the top management shall ensure that appropriate communication processes are established within the organization and that communication takes place regarding the effectiveness of the quality management system. Coming to Clause 5.6, Management Review. Subclause 5.6.1 General specifies that the organization is required to document procedures for management review. Top management is required to review the organization's quality management system at documented planned intervals to ensure its continuing suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. As per this subclause, the review is required to include assessing opportunities for improvement and the need for changes to the quality management system, including the quality policy and quality objectives. The subclause 5.6.1 states that the records from management reviews are required to be maintained to meet the requirements of the standard. Let's talk about subclause 5.6.2, Review Input. This subclause 5.6.2 of ISO 13485 specifies that the input to management review is required to include, but is not limited to, information arising from feedback, complaint handling, reporting to regulatory authorities, audits, monitoring and measurement of processes, monitoring and measurement of products, corrective action, and preventive action, follow-up actions from previous management reviews, changes that could affect the quality management system, recommendations for improvement, and applicable new or revised regulatory requirements. Coming to subclause 5.6.3, Review Output. According to the subclause 5.6.3 of standard, the output from management review is required to be recorded. Subclause says that review output is required to include the input reviewed and any decisions and actions related to improvement needed to maintain the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality management system and its processes. Improvement of product related to customer requirements. Changes needed to respond to applicable new or revised regulatory requirements. Resource needs. Friends, we have discussed Clause 5 of ISO 13485 2016. Now we shall begin with Clause 6, Resource Management of the Standard. The Subclause 6.1, Provision of Resources, states that the organization is required to determine and provide the resources needed to implement the quality management system and to maintain its effectiveness. As per this subclause, organization is also required to determine and provide the resources needed to meet applicable regulatory and customer requirements. Let's talk about subclause 6.2, Human Resources. The clause 6.2, Human Resources, specifies that personnel performing work affecting product quality are required to be competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, skills, and experience. As per this clause 6.2, the organization is required to document the processes for establishing competence, providing the training needed, and ensuring awareness of personnel. As per this clause, the organization is required to determine the necessary competence for personnel performing work affecting product quality, provide training or take other actions to achieve or maintain the necessary competence, evaluate the effectiveness of the actions taken, ensure that its personnel are aware of the relevance and importance of their activities and how they contribute to the achievement of the quality objectives, and maintain appropriate records of education, training, skills, and experience. Clause 6.2 also guides and states that the methodology used to check effectiveness is proportionate to the risk associated with the work for which the training or other action is being provided. Coming to subclause 6.3, Infrastructure. The subclause 6.3 states that the organization is required to document the requirements for the infrastructure needed to achieve conformity to product requirements, prevent product mix-up, and ensure orderly handling of products. Infrastructure includes buildings, workspace and associated utilities, process equipment in the form of hardware and software, and supporting services such as transport, communication, or information systems. As per this clause 6.3, the organization is required to document requirements for the maintenance activities, including the interval of its performing when such maintenance activities affecting the product quality. As appropriate, the requirements shall apply to equipment used in production, the control of the work environment, and monitoring and measurement. Subclause 6.3 states that an organization is required to maintain records of such maintenance. Let's talk about Clause 6.4, Work Environment and Contamination Control. The subclause 6.4.1, Work Environment, says that the organization is required to document the requirements for the work environment needed to achieve conformity to product requirements. As per subclause 6.4.1, the organization is also required to document the requirements for the work environment and the procedures to monitor and control the work environment if the conditions for the work environment can have an adverse effect on the product quality. The organization is required to document requirements for health, cleanliness, and clothing of personnel if contact between such personnel and the product or work environment could affect the medical device safety or performance. This clause specifies that an organization is required to ensure that all personnel who are required to work temporarily under special environmental conditions within the work environment are competent or supervised by a competent person. This subclause 6.4.1 also recommends under a note to refer to ISO 14644 and ISO 14698 for further information. Coming to Subclause 6.4.2, Contamination Control. The Subclause 6.4.2 of ISO 13485-2016 specifies that, as appropriate, the organization is required to plan and document arrangements for the control of contaminated or potentially contaminated products in order to prevent contamination of the work environment, personnel, or product. This clause further states that for sterile medical devices, the organization is required to document requirements for control of contamination with microorganisms or particulate matter and maintain the required cleanliness during assembly or packaging processes. Friends, till now it was about Clause 6, Infrastructure of ISO 13485-2016. Now, let me talk about Clause 7, Product Realization. Subclause 7.1, Planning of Product Realization. This subclause 7.1 of ISO 13485 states that the organization is required to plan and develop the processes needed for product realization. Planning of product realization is required to be consistent with the requirements of the other processes of the quality management system. As per this subclause, the organization is required to document one or more processes for risk management in product realization. According to this subclause, records of risk management activities is required to be maintained by the organization. This clause further states that in planning product realization, the organization is required to determine the aspects as appropriate, quality objectives and requirements for the product, the need to establish processes and documents and to provide resources specific to the product, including infrastructure and work environment, required verification, validation, monitoring, measurement, inspection and test, handling, storage, distribution and traceability activities specific to the product together with the criteria for product acceptance. Records needed to provide evidence that the realization processes and resulting product meet requirements. Subclause 7.1 specifies that the output of this planning is required to be documented in a form suitable for the organization's method of operations. This clause further guides under a note to refer ISO 14971 for more information. Coming to Clause 7.2, Customer-Related Processes. The subclause 7.2.1, Determination of Requirements Related to the Product, states that the organization is required to determine the requirements specified by the customer, including the requirements for delivery and post-delivery activities. This clause says that the organization is required to determine the requirements not stated by the customer, but necessary for specified or intended use as known. According to this subclause 7.2.1, the organization is required to determine the applicable regulatory requirements related to the product. The clause says that organization is required to determine any user training needed to ensure specified performance and safe use of the medical device. As per subclause 7.2.1, an organization is required to define any additional requirements determined by the organization. Coming to subclause 7.2.2, Review of Requirements Related to Product. The subclause 7.2.2 of ISO 13485 specifies that the organization is required to review the requirements related to products. This review is required to be conducted prior to the organization's commitment to supply product to the customer, for example, submission of tenders, acceptance of contracts or orders, acceptance of changes to contracts or orders. As per Subclause 7.2.2, the review is required to ensure that the product requirements are defined and documented. Contract or order requirements differing from those previously expressed are resolved. Applicable regulatory requirements are met. Any user training identified in accordance with Subclause 7.2.1 is available or planned to be available. The organization has the ability to meet the defined requirements. According to this Subclause 7.2.2, organization is required to maintain the records of the results of the review and actions arising from the review. When the customer provides no documented statement of requirement, the customer requirements are required to be confirmed by the organization before acceptance. Clause further says that when product requirements are changed, the organization is required to ensure that relevant documents are amended and that relevant personnel are made aware of the changed requirements. Let's talk about Subclause 7.2.3, Communication. This subclause states that the organization is required to plan and document arrangements for communicating with customers in relation to product information, inquiries, contracts, or order handling, and including amendments. According to this clause, the organization is also required to plan and document arrangements for communicating with customers in relation to customer feedback, including complaints and advisory notices. Lastly, Subclause 7.2.3 states that the organization is required to communicate with regulatory authorities in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. Let us discuss the Clause 7.3 Design and Development of ISO 13485-2016. The Subclause 7.3.1 General states that the organization is required to document procedures for design and development. The Subclause 7.3.2 Design and Development Planning says that the organization is required to plan and control the design and development of the product. As appropriate, design and development planning documents are required to be maintained and updated by organization as the design and development progresses. During design and development planning, the organization is required to document the following: the design and development stages, the review or reviews needed at each design and development stage, the verification, validation, and design transfer activities that are appropriate at each design and development stage, the responsibilities and authorities for design and development, the methods to ensure traceability of design and development outputs to design and development inputs, and the resources needed, including necessary competence of personnel. Let's talk about Subclause 7.3.3 Design and Development Inputs. This subclause says that inputs relating to product requirements are required to be determined and records maintained. These inputs are required to include functional, performance, usability, and safety requirements according to the intended use, applicable regulatory requirements and standards, applicable output of risk management, as appropriate information derived from previous similar designs, and other requirements essential for design and development of the product and processes. As per Subclause 7.3.3, organization is required to review these inputs for adequacy and approved. As per this clause, requirements are required to be completed, ambiguous, able to be verified or validated, and not in conflict with each other. At last, this subclause guides to refer IEC 62366-1 for more information. Coming to the Subclause 7.3.4, Design and Development Outputs. As per this subclause, design and development outputs are required to meet the input requirements for design and development. Design and development outputs are required to provide appropriate information for purchasing, production, and service provision. According to this subclause 7.3.4, outputs are required to contain or reference product acceptance criteria. As per this clause, design and development outputs are required to specify the characteristics of the product that are essential for its safe and proper use. The outputs of design and development are also required to be in a form suitable for verification against the design and development inputs and shall be approved prior to release. Covering the mandatory documentation requirements, Subclause 7.3.4 states that records of the design and development outputs are required to be maintained by organization. Let's start with Subclause 7.3.5, Design and Development Review. This subclause 7.3.5 states that at suitable stages, systematic reviews of design and development is required to be performed in accordance with planned and documented arrangements to evaluate the ability of the results of design and development to meet requirements. As per this clause, design and development is required to be performed in accordance with planned and documented arrangements to identify and propose necessary actions. Subclause says that participants in such reviews are required to include representatives of functions concerned with the design and development stage being reviewed, as well as other specialist personnel are also required to be included. This subclause 7.3.5 specifies that the organization is required to maintain records of the results of the reviews and any necessary actions. Records must also include the identification of the design under review, the participants involved, and the date of the review. Now coming to the subclause 7.3.6, Design and Development Verification. This subclause 7.3.6 of ISO 13485-2016 states that the design and development verification is required to be performed in accordance with planned and documented arrangements to ensure that the design and development outputs have met the design and development input requirements. As per this subclause, the organization is required to document verification plans including methods, acceptance criteria, and as appropriate, statistical techniques with rationale for sample size. Clause further specifies that verification is required to include confirmation that the design outputs meet design inputs when so connected or interfaced. If the intended use requires that the medical device is to be connected to other medical devices or have an interface with them. Subclause 7.3.6 says that an organization is required to maintain the records of the results and conclusions of the verification and necessary actions. Let's discuss now the subclause 7.3.7, Design and Development Validation. According to this subclause, 7.3.7 of ISO 13485-2016, the design and development validation is required to be performed in accordance with planned and documented arrangements to ensure that the resulting product is capable of meeting the requirements for the specified application or intended use. The organization is required to document validation plans that include methods, acceptance criteria, and, as appropriate, statistical techniques with rationale for sample size. The subclause 7.3.7 states that design validation is required to be conducted on representative product. Representative product includes initial production units, batches, or their equivalents. As per clause, the rationale for the choice of product used for validation are required to be recorded. The clause 7.3.7 specifies that as part of design and development validation, the organization is required to perform clinical evaluations or performance evaluations of the medical device in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. A medical device used for clinical evaluation or performance evaluation is not considered to be released for use to the customer. If the intended use requires that the medical device be connected to or have an interface with other medical devices, validation is required to include confirmation that the requirements for the specified application or intended use have been met when so connected or interfaced. Clause states that validation is required to be completed prior to release for use of the product to the customer. Lastly, Subclause 7.3.7 says that organization is required to maintain the records of the results and conclusion of validation and necessary actions. Let's talk about Subclause 7.3.8, Design and Development Transfer. This subclause 7.3.8 of ISO 13485 says that the organization is required to document procedures for transfer of design and development outputs to manufacturing. These procedures are required to ensure that the design and development outputs are verified as suitable for manufacturing before becoming final production specifications and that production capability can meet product requirements. This clause also states that results and conclusions of the transfer are required to be recorded by the organization. Now, coming to Subclause 7.3.9, Control of Design and Development Changes. Subclause 7.3.9 specifies that the organization is required to document procedures to control design and development changes. The organization is required to determine the significance of the change to function, performance, usability, safety, and applicable regulatory requirements for the medical device and its intended use. As per this subclause, design and development changes are required to be identified. Before implementation, the changes are required to be reviewed, verified, validated as appropriate and approved by organization. According to this clause 7.3.9, the review of design and development changes are required to include evaluation of the effect of the changes on constituent parts and product in process or already delivered. The review of design and development changes are also required to include inputs or outputs of risk management and product realization processes. Further, the clause 7.3.9 states that records of changes, their review, and any necessary actions are required to be maintained by organization to meet the requirements of the standard. Now, let's talk about subclause 7.3.10 of the ISO 13485-2016, that is, Design and Development Files. Subclause 7.3.10 specifies that the organization is required to maintain a design and development file for each medical device type or medical device family. This file is required to include or reference records generated to demonstrate conformity to the requirements for design and development and records for design and development changes. Let's discuss subclause 7.4, Purchasing. Let me talk about the subclause 7.4.1, Purchasing Process. This subclause 7.4.1 of ISO 13485 states that the organization is required to document procedures to ensure that purchased product conforms to specified purchasing information. As per this clause, the organization is required to establish criteria for the evaluation and selection of suppliers. The criteria must be based on the supplier's ability to provide product that meets the organization's requirements, based on the performance of the supplier, based on the effect of the purchased product on the quality of the medical device, proportionate to the risk associated with the medical device. Subclause says that the organization is required to plan the monitoring and re-evaluation of suppliers. Supplier performance in meeting requirements for the purchased product must be monitored. The results of the monitoring must provide an input into the supplier re-evaluation process. This clause specifies that non-fulfillment of purchasing requirements are required to be addressed with the supplier proportionate to the risk associated with the purchased product and compliance with applicable regulatory requirements. This subclause 7.4.1 states that records of the results of evaluation, selection, monitoring, and re-evaluation of supplier capability or performance and any necessary actions arising from these activities are required to be maintained to meet the requirements of the standard. Let me talk about subclause 7.4.2, purchasing information. As per this subclause 7.4.2, purchasing information is required to describe or reference the product to be purchased, including, as appropriate, product specifications, requirements for product acceptance, procedures, processes, and equipment, requirements for qualification of supplier personnel, quality management system requirements. Clause specifies that the organization is required to ensure the adequacy of specified purchasing requirements prior to their communication to the supplier. According to this subclause, purchasing information must include, as applicable, a written agreement that the supplier notifies the organization of changes in the purchased product prior to the implementation of any changes that affect the ability of the purchased product to meet specified purchase requirements. Subclause 7.4.2 says that the organization is required to maintain relevant purchasing information in the form of documents and records to the extent required for traceability given in subclause 7.5.9 of the standard. Coming to subclause 7.4.3, verification of purchased product. This subclause 7.4.3 of standard specifies that the organization is required to establish and implement the inspection or other activities necessary for ensuring that purchased product meets specified purchasing requirements. This clause says that the extent of verification activities is required to be based on the supplier's evaluation results and proportionate to the risks associated with the purchased product. As per this subclause, when the organization becomes aware of any changes to the purchased product, the organization is required to determine whether these changes affect the product realization process or the medical device. Clause further states that when the organization or its customer intends to perform verification at the supplier's premises, the organization is required to state the intended verification activities and method of product release in the purchasing information. Lastly, this subclause specifies that organization is required to maintain the records of the verification to meet the requirements of the standard. Friends, let me discuss now the clause 7.5, production and service provision. Subclause 7.5.1, control of production and service provision states that the production and service provision is required to be planned, carried out, monitored, and controlled by organization to ensure that the product conforms to the specifications. According to this subclause, the production controls must include, but are not limited to, documentation of procedures and methods for the control of production, qualification of the infrastructure, implementation of monitoring and measurement of process parameters and product characteristics, availability and use of monitoring and measuring equipment, implementation of defined operations for labeling and packaging, implementation of product release, delivery and post-delivery activities. Subclause 7.5.1 further states that the organization must establish and maintain a record for each medical device or batch of medical devices that provide traceability to the extent specified in the subclause 7.5.9 and identifies the amount manufactured and amount approved for distribution. As per this subclause, the record is required to be verified and approved by the organization. Now coming to subclause 7.5.2, Cleanliness of Product. This subclause 7.5.2 specifies that the organization is required to document requirements for cleanliness of the product or contamination control of product if the product is cleaned by the organization prior to sterilization or its use. Product is supplied non-sterile and is to be subjected to a cleaning process prior to sterilization or its use. Product cannot be cleaned prior to sterilization or its use, and its cleanliness is of significance in use. Product is supplied to be used non-sterile and its cleanliness is of significance in use. And process agents are to be removed from product during the manufacture. Subclause 7.5.2 further states that if product is cleaned in accordance with A or B, which I have just explained, the requirements contained in subclause 6.4.1 of the standard do not apply prior to the cleaning process. Let's talk about subclause 7.5.3, Installation Activities. This subclause 7.5.3 of ISO 13485/2016 says that the organization is required to document requirements for medical device installation and acceptance criteria for verification of installation as appropriate. Subclause specifies that the organization is required to provide documented requirements for medical device installation and verification of installation. If the agreed customer requirements allow installation of the medical device to be performed by an external party other than the organization or its supplier. Clause 7.5.3 further states that the organization or its supplier is required to maintain records of medical device installation and verification of installation performed. Coming to the subclause 7.5.4, Servicing Activities. As per this subclause 7.5.3, if servicing of the medical device is a specified requirement, the organization is required to document servicing procedures, reference materials, and reference measurements for performing servicing activities as necessary. The organization is also required verifying that product requirements are met. Subclause 7.5.4 specifies that the organization is required to analyze records of servicing activities carried out by the organization or its supplier to determine if the information is to be handled as a complaint and also for input to the improvement process as appropriate. According to this subclause, records of servicing activities carried out by the organization or its supplier are required to be maintained to meet the requirement of the standard. Now, let's talk about the subclause 7.5.5 of ISO 13485/2016, that is, particular requirements for sterile medical devices. According to this subclause 7.5.5, the organization is required to maintain records of the sterilization process parameters used for each sterilization batch. Sterilization records are required to be traceable to each production batch of medical devices. Coming to Subclause 7.5.6, Validation of Processes for Production and Service Provision. This Subclause 7.5.6 specifies that the organization is required to validate any processes for production and service provision where the resulting output cannot be or is not verified by subsequent monitoring or measurement, and as a consequence, deficiencies become apparent only after the product is in use or the service has been delivered. The clause says that validation is required to demonstrate the ability of these processes to achieve planned results consistently. Further, the Subclause 7.5.6 states that the organization is required to document procedures for validation of processes, including defined criteria for review and approval of the processes, equipment qualification and qualification of the personnel, use of specific methods, procedures, and acceptance criteria, as appropriate statistical techniques with rationale for sample sizes, requirements for records, revalidation, including criteria for revalidation, and approval of changes to the processes. The subclause says that the organization is required to document procedures for the validation of the application of computer software used in production and service provision. Such software applications are required to be validated prior to the initial use and after any changes to such software or its application. The clause states that the specific approach and activities associated with software validation and revalidation is also required to be proportionate to the risk associated with the use of the software, including the effect on the ability of the product to conform to specifications. Lastly, the subclause 7.5.6 specifies that the records of the results and conclusion of validation and necessary actions from the validation must be maintained by the organization. Let's talk about subclause 7.5.7, that is, particular requirements for validation of processes for sterilization and sterile barrier systems. According to this subclause, the organization is required to document procedures for the validation of processes for sterilization and sterile barrier systems. This clause says that processes for sterilization and sterile barrier systems must be validated prior to implementation and following product or process changes as appropriate. As per this clause 7.5.7, records of the results and conclusion of validation and necessary actions from the validation must be maintained to meet the requirements of the standard. This clause also guides to refer ISO 11607-1 and ISO 11607-2 for further information about it. Friends, let's discuss now the subclause 7.5.8 of ISO 13485-2016, Identification. According to this subclause, the organization must document procedures for product identification and identify product by suitable means throughout product realization. The organization is required to identify product status with respect to monitoring and measurement requirements throughout product realization. Identification of product status is required to be maintained throughout production, storage, installation, and servicing of product to ensure that only product that has passed the requirement inspections and tests. This also includes ensuring the product is released under an authorized concession being dispatched, used, or installed. Subclause 7.5.8 further states that the organization is required to document a system to assign unique device identification to the medical device, if required by applicable regulatory requirements. As per this clause, the organization must document procedures to ensure that medical devices returned to the organization are identified and distinguished from conforming product. Let's discuss now the subclause 7.5.9, traceability. The subclause 7.5.9.1 general specifies that the organization is required to document procedures for traceability. These procedures must define the extent of traceability in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements and the records to be maintained. Coming to subclause 7.5.9.2, particular requirements for implantable medical devices. This subclause 7.5.9.2 of ISO 13485 states that the records required for traceability must include records of components, materials, and conditions for the work environment used. If these could cause the medical device not to satisfy its specified safety and performance requirements. Further, this subclause says that the organization is required that suppliers of distribution services or distributors maintain records of the distribution of medical devices to allow traceability. The organization is also required to ensure that these records are available for inspection. Subclause 7.5.9.2 states that the records of the name and address of the shipping package consignee is required to be maintained to meet the requirements of the standard. Let us now discuss the subclause 7.5.10, customer property. According to this subclause of ISO 13485, the organization is required to identify, verify, protect, and safeguard customer property provided for the use or incorporation into the product while it is under the organization's control or being used by the organization. Subclause states that if any customer property is lost, damaged, or otherwise found to be unsuitable for use, the organization is required to report this to the customer and maintain the records. Coming to subclause 7.5.11, preservation of products. This subclause 7.5.11 says that the organization is required to document procedures for preserving the conformity of product to requirements during processing, storage, handling, and distribution. This clause further states that preservation must apply to the constituent parts of a medical device. This subclause specifies that the organization is required to protect product from alteration, contamination, or damage when exposed to expected conditions and hazards during processing, storage, handling, and distribution by designing and constructing suitable packaging and shipping containers. As per this clause 7.5.11, if packaging alone cannot provide preservation, the organization is required to protect product by documenting requirements for special conditions needed. Lastly, the subclause states that if special conditions are required, they shall be controlled and recorded by the organization to meet the requirements of the standard. Now, let us talk about clause 7.6, control of monitoring and measuring equipment. This subclause 7.6 of ISO 13485 states that the organization is required to determine the monitoring and measurement to be undertaken and the monitoring and measuring equipment needed to provide evidence of conformity of product to determine requirements. Clause says that the organization is required to document procedures to ensure that monitoring and measurement can be carried out in a manner that is consistent with the monitoring and measurement requirements. As per subclause 7.6, as necessary to ensure valid results, measuring equipment must be calibrated or verified, or both, at specified intervals or prior to use against measurement standards traceable to international or national measurement standards. When no such standards exist, the basis used for calibration or verification shall be recorded. Measuring equipment must be adjusted or readjusted as necessary. Such adjustments or readjustments shall be recorded. Measuring equipment must have identification in order to determine its calibration status. Measuring equipment must be safeguarded from adjustments that would invalidate the measurement result, and measuring equipment must be protected from damage and deterioration during handling, maintenance, and storage. Subclause 7.6 states that the organization is required to perform calibration or verification in accordance with documented procedures. In addition, the organization must assess and record the validity of the previous measuring results when the equipment is found not to conform to requirements. As per this clause 7.6, the organization is required to take appropriate action in regards to the equipment and any product affected. Organization is also required to maintain the records of the results of calibration and verification. According to this clause, the organization must document procedures for the validation of the application of computer software used for the monitoring and measurement of the requirements. As per clause, such software applications are required to be validated prior to initial use and, as appropriate, after changes to such software or its application. The specific approach and activities associated with software validation and revalidation must be proportionate to the risk associated with the use of the software, including the effect on the ability of the product to conform to specifications. Subclause 7.6 further states that the records of the results and conclusion of validation and necessary actions from the validation must be maintained by organization to meet the requirements of the standard. Lastly, the clause guides to refer ISO 10012 for more information. Friends, till now it was all about the clause 7, product realization of ISO 13485 2016. Now we shall discuss about the clause 8 of standard, that is measurement, analysis and improvement. Let's start with subclause 8.1 general. According to this subclause 8.1 of ISO 13485, the organization is required to plan and implement the monitoring, measurement, analysis, and improvement processes needed to demonstrate conformity of the product, to ensure conformity of the quality management system, and to maintain the effectiveness of the quality management system. As per clause, monitoring, measurement, analysis, and improvement processes must include determination of appropriate methods, including statistical techniques and the extent of their use. Now, coming to subclause 8.2, monitoring and measurement. Let me start with 8.2.1, feedback. As one of the measurements of the effectiveness of the quality management system, the organization is required to gather and monitor information relating to whether the organization has met customer requirements. As per clause 8.2.1, the methods for obtaining and using this information must be documented. The subclause 8.2.1 states that the organization is required to document procedures for the feedback process. This feedback process must include provisions to gather data from production as well as post-production activities. According to this subclause, the information gathered in the feedback process must serve as potential input into risk management for monitoring and maintaining the product requirements as well as the product realization or improvement processes. Subclause further states that if applicable regulatory requirements require the organization to gain specific experience from post-production activities, the review of this experience must form part of the feedback process. Let's talk about 8.2.2, complaint handling. This subclause 8.2.2 of ISO 13485 states that the organization is required to document procedures for timely complaint handling in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. These procedures must include, at a minimum, requirements and responsibilities for receiving and recording information, evaluating information to determine if the feedback constitutes a complaint, investigating complaints, determining the need to report the information to the appropriate regulatory authorities, handling of complaint-related product, and determining the need to initiate corrections or corrective actions. This clause says that if any complaint is not investigated, organization is required to document the justification. An organization is also required to document any correction or corrective action resulting from the complaint handling process. As per this subclause, if an investigation determines activities outside the organization contributed to the complaint, then relevant information is required to be exchanged between the organization and the external party involved. Lastly, as per this subclause 8.2.2, the complaint handling records are required to be maintained by the organization to meet the requirements of the standard. ISO 13485-2016. Let me discuss now the subclause 8.2.3, reporting to regulatory authorities. This subclause 8.2.3 specifies that the organization is required to document procedures for providing notification to the appropriate regulatory authorities. If applicable regulatory requirements require notification of complaints that meet specified reporting criteria of adverse events or issuance of advisory notices. Further, according to this clause, records of reporting to regulatory authorities are required to be maintained by the organization. Now, let me come to the subclause 8.2.4 of ISO 13485-2016, that is, internal audit. According to this subclause, the organization is required to conduct internal audits at planned intervals to determine whether the quality management system conforms to planned and documented arrangements, requirements of this international standard, quality management system requirements established by the organization, and applicable regulatory requirements. Subclause 8.2.4 also specifies that the organization is required to conduct internal audits at planned intervals to determine whether the quality management system is effectively implemented and maintained. This subclause states that the organization must document a procedure to describe the responsibilities and requirements for planning and conducting audits and recording and reporting audit results. According to this subclause, an audit program is required to be planned by an organization, taking into consideration the status and importance of the processes and area to be audited, as well as the results of previous audits. Subclause 8.2.4 says that the audit criteria, scope, interval, and methods must be defined and recorded by the organization. The organization is required to ensure that the selection of auditors and conduct of audits must ensure objectivity and impartiality of the audit process. This clause states that the auditors must not audit their own work during the internal audit. Further, this subclause states that the organization is required to maintain the records of the audits and their results, including identification of the processes and areas audited, and also the conclusions of the audits. The subclause 8.2.4 states that the management is responsible for the area being audited, must ensure that any necessary corrections and corrective actions are taken without undue delay to eliminate detected non-conformities and their causes. The organization is required to include the verification of the actions taken and the reporting of verification results of follow-up activities. At the end, the clause guides to study ISO 19011 for further information about it. Coming to the subclause 8.2.5, monitoring and measurement of processes. This subclause 8.2.5 of ISO 13485 states that the organization is required to apply suitable methods for monitoring and measurement of the quality management system processes as appropriate. These methods must demonstrate the ability of the processes to achieve planned results. As per clause, organization is required to take appropriate correction and corrective actions when planned results are not achieved. Let us now discuss the subclause 8.2.6, monitoring and measurement of product. The subclause 8.2.6 specifies that the organization is required to monitor and measure the characteristics of the product to verify that product requirements have been met. This must be carried out at applicable stages of the product realization process in accordance with the planned and documented arrangements and documented procedures. This subclause says that evidence of conformity to the acceptance criteria must be maintained by the organization. The organization must record the identity of the person authorizing release of the product. According to this clause 8.2.6, appropriate records must identify the test equipment used to perform measurement activities. Further, as per this standard, the product release and service delivery must not proceed until the planned and documented arrangements have been satisfactorily completed. The subclause 8.2.6 states that for implantable medical devices, the organization is required to record the identity of personnel performing any inspection or testing. Let us talk about subclause 8.3, control of non-conforming product. Subclause 8.3.1 general states that the organization is required to ensure that product which does not conform to product requirements is identified and controlled to prevent its unintended use or delivery. This clause says that the organization must document a procedure to define the controls and related responsibilities and authorities for the identification, documentation, segregation, evaluation, and disposition of non-conforming product. As per this subclause 8.3.1, the evaluation of non-conformity must include a determination of the need for an investigation and notification of any external party responsible for the non-conformity. Further, this subclause states that organization is required to maintain the records of the nature of the non-conformities and any subsequent action taken, including the evaluation. Organization must also maintain any investigation and the rationale for decisions to meet the requirements of the standard. Coming to subclause 8.3.2, actions in response to non-conforming product detected before delivery. This subclause 8.3.2 of ISO 13485 2016 states that the organization is required to deal with non-conforming product by one or more of the ways, like taking action to eliminate the detected non-conformity, taking action to prelude its original intended use or application, and authorizing its use, release, or acceptance under concession. According to this subclause 8.3.2, the organization must ensure that non-conforming product is accepted by concession only if the justification is provided, approval is obtained, and applicable regulatory requirements are met. The subclause specifies that organization is required to maintain the records of the acceptance by concession and the identity of the person authorizing the concession to meet the requirements of the standard. Let's talk now about the subclause 8.3.3, actions in response to non-conforming product detected after delivery. This subclause states that when non-conforming product is detected after delivery or use has started, the organization is required to take action appropriate to the effects or potential effects of the non-conformity. This subclause also says that the organization is required to maintain the records of actions. The subclause 8.3.3 states that the organization must document procedures for issuing advisory notices in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. These procedures must be capable of being put into effect at any time. According to this subclause, organization is required to maintain records of actions relating to the issuance of advisory notices. Coming to subclause 8.3.4, rework. This subclause 8.3.4 states that the organization must perform rework in accordance with documented procedures that take into account the potential adverse effects of the rework on the product. These procedures must undergo the same review and approval as the original procedure. Clause 8.3.4 states that after the completion of the rework, product must be verified to ensure that it meets applicable acceptance criteria and regulatory requirements. Lastly, the subclause 8.3.4 of ISO 13485 specifies that organization is required to maintain the records of rework to meet the requirements of this standard. Let us talk about clause 8.4, analysis of data. This clause 8.4 of ISO 13485 2016 says that the organization is required to document procedures to determine, collect, and analyze appropriate data to demonstrate the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality management system. The procedures must include determination of appropriate methods, including statistical techniques and the extent of their use. Further, the clause 8.4 says that the analysis of data must include data generated as a result of monitoring and measurement and from other relevant sources. The data must include, at a minimum, input from feedback, conformity to product requirements, characteristics and trends of processes and products, including opportunities for improvement, suppliers, audits, and service reports as appropriate. This clause further states that if the analysis of the data shows that the quality management system is not suitable, adequate, or effective, the organization must use this analysis as input for improvement as required in clause 8.5 of the standard. Lastly, the clause 8.4 specifies that the organization is required to records of the results of analysis to meet the requirements of the standard. We shall now talk about clause 8.5, improvement. Let me discuss the subclause 8.5.1, general. Subclause 8.5.1 of ISO 13485 specifies that the organization is required to identify and implement any changes necessary to ensure and maintain the continued suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality management system. The organization is also required to identify and implement any changes necessary to ensure and maintain medical device safety and performance through the use of the quality policy, quality objectives, audit results, post-market surveillance, analysis of data, corrective actions, preventive actions, and management review. Coming now to the subclause 8.5.2, corrective action. According to this subclause 8.5.2, the organization must take action to eliminate the cause of non-conformities in order to prevent recurrence. The organization is required to take any necessary corrective actions without undue delay. As per this clause 8.5.2, corrective actions must be proportionate to the effects of the non-conformities encountered. This clause says that the organization must document a procedure to define requirements for reviewing non-conformities, including complaints, determining the causes of non-conformities, evaluating the need for action to ensure that non-conformities do not recur, planning and documenting action needed, and implementing such action, including, as appropriate, updating documentation. Verifying that the corrective action does not adversely affect the ability to meet applicable regulatory requirements or the safety and performance of the medical device, and reviewing the effectiveness of corrective action taken. Further, Subclause 8.5.2 of ISO 13485 states that the organization is required to maintain the records of the results of any investigation and of action taken to meet the requirements of the standard. Let us discuss the subclause 8.5.3 Preventive Action. According to this subclause 8.5.3, the organization is required to determine action to eliminate the causes of potential non-conformities in order to prevent their occurrence. Subclause says that the preventive actions must be proportionate to the effects of the potential problems. Further, the subclause 8.5.3 states that the organization must document a procedure to describe requirements for determining potential non-conformities and their causes, evaluating the need for action to prevent occurrence of non-conformities, planning and documenting action needed, and implementing such action, including, as appropriate, updating documentation. Verifying that the action does not adversely affect the ability to meet applicable regulatory requirements or the safety and performance of the medical device, and reviewing the effectiveness of the preventive action taken as appropriate. This clause specifies that the organization must maintain the records of the results of any investigations and of action taken to meet the requirements of the standard. Friends, we have finished all the clauses of ISO 13485 2016 Medical Devices Quality Management System. The standard ISO 13485 2016 also provides a correspondence between ISO 13485 2016 and ISO 9001 2015 under Annex B and a bibliography for more detailed information about various fundamentals, techniques, and requirements, etc. You can see here on the screen the correspondence between ISO 13485 2016 and ISO 9001 2015 and bibliography at the end of the session, and could explore more about the standards. So friends, now we have reached at the end of this session. I hope that you have an idea about ISO 13485 2016 Medical Devices Quality Management System. For more information about our institute and other training programs, you can contact us through email or phone. I sincerely thank you for all your interest and attention. Thanks and best wishes.